I have heard Bruce mention Jim Barnett a few times, but what was his role and what stories can you tell us about him?
So Jim Barnett was a promoter, his wrestling promoter. Jim was from the Chicago area, and Jim was a promoter in Chicago, and then he became very powerful in the NWA. Jim was I wouldn't say he was closeted homosexual. Jim was very out with his gayness. Jim had a life partner, but Jim also was very flamboyant and didn't care back in the day when that wasn't as accepted as it is today. So, Jim went from Chicago, he went to Australia, he opened up Australia. Jim, as a promoter, was one of the just smartest guys I've ever met because he was so innovative in the way that Jim used television. Jim learned very early on to utilize television as a commercial to promote your live events. And if you had good television, you had strong television, then your live events would thrive. So Jim went to Australia, same thing. At the time, Australia was probably 15 years behind the United States in innovation. Jim went to Australia, opened up Australia as a promoter, and television was doing the same things that he had done in the United States and just popped the territory huge. And Jim ran Australia, ran New Zealand, but he still kept a hold on an arm's length with the NWA. Then Jim came back to the States. Jim went to Atlanta, and I'm probably missing a whole lot. I'm just giving you a big, broad brushstrokes of Jimsy. And Jim went to Atlanta, became one of the most powerful men in the entire wrestling business as a promoter, but also as a member of the NWA. He was on the board, and, Jim did that WTBS Superstation. So Jim was the first one really to take wrestling national on cable TV on channel 17, WTBS. So Jim was extremely powerful, man. And Jim was a part of the group that sold their shares in Georgia Championship Wrestling to Vince McMahon so that Vince would become majority owner of Georgia Championship Wrestling and get on WTBS. And that's where people refer to as Black Saturday, when the WWE took over the WTBS 605 time slot away from the NWA. And, Jim Barnett threatened to kill him. But then, Vince brought Jim into the WWE as a consultant, and Jim was business affairs vice president for the NWA. I mean, not for the NWA, for WWE. And in 1987, when I started up there, I actually lived in the same condominium complex as Jim, literally right across the courtyard from him. And Jim attempted suicide like the third day that I was there. And Jim would always lament to Vince that, I want to go home. I want to go back to Atlanta. I want to help Crockett. I want to do this. And Vince kind of guy, if you tell him that stuff, he's okay. Well, you're unhappy here, go. I think Jim was just kind of crying for attention, but Vince let him go, and Jim went down and worked for Crockett. He worked for Turner for a while with WCW. And in later years, I would call Jim, right up until the time that Jim passed. I would call Jim every single week and get his feedback and input on the television shows. Tell me what you liked. Tell me what you didn't like. What would you do? And Jim had a different perspective on the business. And the fact that he was outside of the business by this point in his life, I thought that his insight was even more valuable. And just, I learned so much from that man. Extremely bright, innovative, so far ahead of his time. And yeah, Jim Barnett was a megastar in this business.
Can you give us an example of one of the things you learned? You said, I learned so much from that man. Is there one specific example where you can remember he improved something or at least changed your mind about something?
John Cena. First time he saw John Cena, he said that he goes, he's a star. He's the guy. And, it was very early on when John had just started. We were scratching our heads trying to figure out what to do with John. He had something, he had it, but not really knowing what to do.
Right.
And Jim was like, that's your next guy. He will be the guy. And I'm like, yeah, Jim, I get it, man. He's got all the tools and everything. But right now, I think he's a little green. He says, get behind him. He's the guy. And he was right. He saw it before any of us saw it. There were little things, like Tommy Rich. People didn't get Tommy Rich. He had no body, but the son of a bitch had charisma.
Yeah.
And Jim saw that. Jim looked at Tommy Rich and says, you know what? He draws the girls. He draws the women. Where the women are, the men are going to come. And you have an audience now.
Right.
And if you have a good-looking, young guy that draws good-looking young women, you're going to draw other young people, and your audience is going to swell, and it's going to grow from there.
Why do you think whenever people talk about, because like whenever people talk about Pat Patterson, I feel like he gets his flowers. People refer to him as like wrestling's Yoda, like he's one of the all-time great minds of wrestling. But it feels like whenever we talk about Barnett, a lot of times people just go to the impression or they talk about his sexuality, whereas that's not always the case for a guy like Pat. What's the difference between the two as far as the way they're revered, after the fact?
Pat had a different type of mind. Pat had a mind for the creative in the business. In the ring, Barnett had a mind for the business end of things. So I would say that other than Barnett never being a performer, Jim Barnett's acumen and mind was just as great as Pat's. And the reason I think that, people bring up the sexuality is because you got to understand, folks, anybody listening to this is 20, 30 years old. You got to go back 60 years, 70 years. There wasn't acceptance of people for who they were. Right. If you were different, man, you were different. You were ostracized. And Jim was outward with his sexuality, who he was, and was extremely successful.
Didn't slow it down.
In spite of it all. In a business where, it was run by big tough guys and, I'm a former football player. I'm this tough guy. I'll do this, blah, blah, blah. And Barnett kept him in line because he was a businessman. Right. And he was brilliant. So all that stuff. And the reason you bring that up is because of the success that he had when there was so much against him.
Right.
And he fought through it. And he proved himself because he was that good.
Well said, Bruce. I'm glad we gave him some attention today.